great to have you again. If you're new, welcome. We hope that you will enjoy today's program and continue on with future Jewish Gen Talks in this series. We have a very interesting presentation today. My name is Avraham Grohl, and I'm privileged to oversee Jewish Gen. And we have a very interesting program today with Rabbi Elli Fischer, who is going to talk to us about what we can learn from Prenumeranten Lists. And a Prenumeranten List meant it was a Yiddish term for prior numbers. In other words, it meant people who ordered a copy of a book before it came out. And these people would have their names listed in the book, and they would see that they were people who had supported the publication of this book. And Rabbi Fischer will talk to us more about it and the genealogical value of the names and what you can learn from how they're grouped together and the towns that they're associated with, and how you can extrapolate other life events as a result of the names that are published in these books. Rabbi Fischer's project is through something called HaMapah.org, which is a multi-year project working on extracting information from these Prenumeranten lists. It's funded by a number of universities. Jewish Gen has partnered with HaMapah.org. We've shared access to our communities database, so they can help identify the communities that are listed in these Prenumeranten books. It's very, very interesting, and we're looking forward, Rabbi Fischer, to your talk. Something that we have not focused on as much, but that Jewish Gen had done years ago, was on rabbinic genealogy, and it's something that we'd like to get back to. So I encourage anybody who's listening or participating on this webinar, if you're interested in rabbinic genealogy and getting involved on Jewish Gen, please reach out. You can email me at agroll@JewishGen.org, AGROLL@JewishGen.org, and I'd be glad to discuss with you opportunities of how we could make information accessible and how we could approach trying to raise more awareness of rabbinic genealogy. Just a brief note, two notes. First of all, the session is being recorded, and we'll post a link on the discussion group when the recording is available. And just a brief note about our speaker. Rabbi Fischer is an independent writer, translator, and editor. He has edited Rabbi Eliezer Melamed's Peninei Halakha series in English, and is, of course, the co-founder of HaMapah, a project that is applying quantitative analysis to rabbinic literature. He is the founding editor of the Lehrhaus. His writing has appeared in numerous Jewish publications. He has degrees from Yeshiva University, rabbinic ordination from the Israeli Chief Rabbinate, and he is currently working towards a doctorate in Jewish history at Tel Aviv University. Perhaps most importantly, he's originally from Baltimore, and today he lives in Israel. And we're glad, Rabbi Fischer, you're with us, and I pass it over to you.
Thank you. So it happens to be, it's a distinct honor to speak on behalf of Jewish Gen, the Jewish genealogy portal. I sort of, every family has that one person that actually knows the family history, and somehow I became that person in my family. So I've been a user of the Jewish Gen portal for many years for my own research. And when we launched this project, this project, the Jewish genealogy was one of the the greatest available resources for a lot of the things that we're trying to do. And a lot of the people in the various Jewish genealogy forums have know exactly what Prenumeranten are, and have done a lot of their own research into this little subgenre. And it takes a village. There's a lot of things that we're doing that we couldn't do without a lot of the legwork that's already been done. And and even if we could, sometimes it would just be it would take a lot longer, and it would be a lot more difficult. So let's start talking about what are Prenumeranten. So Prenumeranten I like to describe as a Kickstarter campaign. As Avram mentioned, it means basically pre-number, right? They were numbered beforehand. They were subscribers. And interestingly enough, it's not an originally Jewish, it was not an originally Jewish idea. There were books already in the early 1700s that were published with these, with pre-subscriber lists. There are even, at the Leipzig Fair, which was the largest book fair in the world, there are records of subscriptions. And the truth of the matter is, we don't even know how far back it goes, because it was only starting in the late 1700s or earlier in the general world and in the Jewish world in the late 1700s that people started publishing these lists in the book themselves. It could be that there were subscriptions earlier. I found a couple of references to subscriptions to earlier books, but we don't have the list because they weren't published in the book, and I haven't yet found. Maybe someday we'll get lucky and we'll find them, but we haven't yet found a list of subscribers to a book published before 1775. 1775 is the earliest date that we've found. Now, we're talking about 2,300 different editions, different books. And sometimes it's several printings of the same book. Sometimes it's different volumes of the same book. We're talking about over 10,000 places that are mentioned in these books, distinct places, distinct communities, cities, towns, villages, all over the world, but primarily in Europe. And we're talking about an order of magnitude of about 1 million names. Now, by order of magnitude, and we haven't counted yet, but somewhere between, I would be very surprised if it's less than 500,000, and I would be very surprised if it's more than 1.5 million. Now, these aren't individuals, but these are, the same person can recur again and again on different lists. So we don't know exactly how many people we're talking about, and we'll get there as our project continues. But for now, we're talking, we talk about an order of magnitude of 1 million names. The purpose of our project is to create an online open source database of all of this information. Basically, we're in the process of obtaining high resolution scans of the lists of all 2,300 books. And we've identified the vast majority of places that appear in these books. There's still a few thousand places to identify, but for now, we've identified the vast majority, over 70%, and all of the big ones, meaning the small places that aren't identified are places that are hard to identify because they only appear once or twice in this entire literature. And eventually, we're going to get down to the level of the individual subscriber. We're going to have we're going to digitize these subscription lists, and we are going to create records for each book. What are the actual names of the subscribers? Now, in terms of the overlap, how do we find out? How do we figure out whether one person is the same person? The Yosef ben Shimon that appears in this list and the Yosef ben Shimon that appears in that list, how do we know that they're the same person? Well, it's by the way that they're, the name itself, plus the year of publication, plus the place of publication. That's still going to generate a lot of ambiguities, and there's still going to be a lot of questions about, what if in one book a person is Yaakov and in another book a person is Yaakov or Yankel or something like that, or in one book there's a surname, and in the other book there's just a patronym. So that's the kind of thing that we're sort of hoping, meaning we're going to have the names, but the identity, the job of actually finding the same people that appear on the list, more that appear in different lists in different forms, we're hoping that that's going to be, as it were, crowdsourced, right? That there are people that are going to notice that the same name appears in two different places and will tell us that these are the same people, that this person and that person is the same person. And in that sense, I mean, the primary focus of our project is not genealogical. We'll get into what sorts of things we hope to learn from this, but the genealogical aspect is definitely something that's very much on the radar, and this is a wealth of information that will be valuable to genealogists. As I mentioned, we recently completed the first of 3 years of the project, so we still have a ways to go. And the harder part is going to be, once we have all of everything scanned and all of the books identified and all of the books, we're going to link to existing catalogs. One of our goals is to make sure that all of the information that we have plays well with information from other sources. So if we're talking about a place, we'll include where that place shows up in the JewishGen communities database, where it shows up, if it shows up in what are its coordinates, right? Because the same name, the same place can have lots of different names depending on who's in charge. And Jews sometimes gave places an entirely different name. Usually, if the real name had some sort of Christian symbolism or overtone. It's before Pesach, so I'm going to throw Pesach in whenever I can. So one of the larger matzah bakeries, I don't know if it still is, I haven't been in the US for Pesach for a very long time, but one of the larger bakeries when I was growing up was Papa Tselem. Right, so these are two places, Papa and Tselem. Papa is a city in Hungary, and in Western Hungary, and Tselem you're never going to find on any regular map. Salem is one of those cities that it was Hungary until World War II. After World War II, it went to Austria. It's in the area called the Burgenland, or the Siebenbergen. I'm sorry, the Siebengemeinden in the Burgenland in Austria. That's extremely, south and east of Vienna. And the proper name for that city, for that town, is Deutschkreuz, which means German cross. So Jews didn't like talking about crosses, so they called it Salem, which is the standard Yiddish word for a cross, which literally means an image. A Salem. So that's when you buy the puppet Salem matzah, that's Salem. Deutschkreuz, today Austria. Here's an example of one page of what you might find in Prenumeranten. Now there is no standard format. I'm sorry, so when it comes to Salem, right? So we identify Salem with the contemporary place name of Deutschkreuz, Austria. We also, because it's linked to the JewishGen communities database, all the other names for it will be linked to it. And you'll have the coordinates so that you'll be able to find it on a map. In a little while, I'll show you, we actually have a map of all of the places that we've already identified with Hebrew spellings. We have something like 17,000 variant Hebrew spellings for place names around the world. So here's what a page of Prenumeranten look like, right? It says Prenumeranten, which will be the first word. Sometimes it'll be Hebrew, Shemot Nirshamim, Ele Shmot HaNedivim Anshe Shem. These are the names of the generous people of renown, Asher Tamchu et Yadai B'Hotzaat Hadfus, who supported me, with the expenses of printing. Charutim al Haluach L'Zikaron, and here I've etched them, I've engraved them on this panel for a memorial. Elohim Ya'ashrem B'yizgu Chaya. Right? May God help them. May God increase their wealth. Okay, so this actually, right? So and then it has a list. Ir Chadash, right? So Ir Chadash can mean a lot of places. Ir Chadash literally means new city. So any place called new city or the equivalent would be Ir Chadash. Right? So Nove Mesto, or Neustadt, or Villanova, or Naples, or even in Israel you have Shechem, right? Which in the Arabic word, which comes from the Latin, is Nablus, which comes from Neapolis, which means new city. So, or Newton, Massachusetts, all of these places could be Ir Chadash. This is probably, right, so that's a disambiguation challenge. This one is probably Nove Mesto nad Vahom, which is in today's Slovakia, because the other places here are also in that area. Semnitz is in Slovakia as well, and that's usually how we can tell, right? We actually have we're developing an algorithm that when you have a place name which shares a name or a spelling with another place name, you'll be able to, it automatically assigns it to, oh, it must be talking about this one because that's the one that's closer to the other places on the list. Okay, this is a sample page from a book called Chakirat HaGemul, which appeared in Budapest in 1829. So again, that would also reinforce where something is published, would also reinforce where, how to disambiguate place names. When talking about Prenumeranten, the first name that will come up is the name of Beryl Kagan. Beryl Kagan published a book in 1975 called Sefer HaPrenumeranten. This is what a page of Beryl Kagan's book looks like. It's a list, primarily a list of towns, and each town has a list of books from which there were subscribers. So for example, in Cardiff, in Wales, you had subscribers from Otzar Yisrael, volume 7, 8, and 10, and from a book called Kos Yeshuot, and from a book called, the first volume of a book called Rutz Katzvi. And it even gives you the number of subscribers from each town. And he's not always certain about his identifications, as you can see from the question marks. And sometimes he'll have a parentheses, right? That happens when, so usually, as we saw earlier, the prenumeranten are organized by city. It'll list a city, right? So imagine you're going from town to town collecting subscribers. You go to a city, you take a page of your ledger and you write the name of the city at the top of the page. And then you write the names of all of the people that live in that city who bought the book from that city. But sometimes you'll have outliers. Sometimes you'll be in one city and you'll meet a person from another city and they'll buy the book. So you have, for example, here in Ir Chadash, you have the last entry for Ir Chadash, Harav Mor Hagola Av Bezdin the Kal Kadosh Dritema. Right? So even though he's in Ir Chadash, but he meets there and he sells a book to the Av Beit Din of Dritema. I don't have offhand. We can look it up. You know what? Well, I'll demonstrate that in. Let's demonstrate that now. We want to know where Dritema is. So I'm going to share a different screen now. Okay, so now we're on our site, the HaMapah site. And what we did was we created what we call the searchable map of Hebrew place names. So this is showing the United States, but here. You have, in Europe, you have 17,000 different variants. And what you can do, which is, we think, pretty cool, you can punch in the Hebrew spelling of any place. So you go here to where it says Hebrew name, and you start Dri, and by the time you get to Daled Resh Yud Tet, you already have Dritima, which is Driatoma, Slovakia. So I didn't know where that was. I saw, okay, the rabbi of Dritima bought a book. Where's Dritima? You start putting it in, and there it is. And it's exactly where we expect it to be, because we saw that he met this rabbi in Ir Chadash. Ir Chadash, I suggested, was Nova Mesto Nad Vahom, which is really just a few miles away from Dritema, right? When you zoom out, you see how close they really are, right? That's Slovakia as a whole. When you zoom back in, you see just how close Dritema and Nova Mesto are. Okay. Back to, okay, and this is publicly available. Anybody can use this. The link, I'll share the link. You can get it from our main page. It's right here on the top menu. But this is, we think, an amazing resource. It is built in part on the JewishGen Communities database. We actually took data from the JewishGen Communities database, from Beryl Kagan's book, which at the back has an index where he gives the Hebrew spelling with the Latin and a Latin character spelling of a lot of the place names. He doesn't get them all, and there are a lot of misidentifications, but he has a lot. And some of them are our own that we discovered either through Prenumeranten, or we also have a project where we work on rabbinic responsa and map out where particular rabbis wrote responsa to, wrote answers to, wrote letters to, and sort of map out their spheres of influence based on that. So a lot of the places that appear there don't appear in any of the other lists. So those are the basic sources of where we're getting our list of names from. And a lot of this, the actual identification is something that we've got to do one by one. The scraping of the data from Prenumeranten, or from, we digitized Beryl Kagan, and so we now, we can search, we have a digital version, a digitized version via OCR of Beryl Kagan's book. I'll show you, so let's take a look first at Kagan's book. We saw a sample page before. This is Beryl Kagan's book. So the bulk of it is a list of about 9,000 places. And then in the back, he has an index by number. So he has an index of how he identifies the places, right? So this one, which I downloaded from Hebrew Books, it actually is searchable. So for example, if you have Nera, right, which is number 5461 on this, on Kagan's list, and you can run a search within the PDF for 5461, and if the OCR works well, right, so there's one instance, and yeah, and there's the second instance, Nera. And those are the two books that from which there are subscribers from Nera. Now, what we went ahead and did what we went ahead and did is we digitized it, and this we have not yet released. But let's take, for example, okay. So this is a little app that we, and by we I mean I work together with Moshe Shor, who's a student at the Technion in Haifa, and with Professor Marcin Wodzinski, who's a Jewish historian at the University of Wrocław in Poland. If you've seen his Atlas of Chassidut, it's a phenomenal work. So Moshe, like, we're all involved in various parts of the project. Moshe, you know, this is Moshe's handiwork. Moshe takes, Moshe built this. So let's take, as an example, one of the books, Ayelet HaShachar. And this is one of the books that's indexed by Kagan. So apparently there are only 2 places from which there was a subscription. So let's take a different one. Avot de Rabbi Natan. Okay, here we go. That's a more substantive list of Prenumeranten. So you see, when we map out the list, when we map out the, right, this was done, you know, once we identify most of the places, we can do this automatically. You see how dense the subscriptions are in what's today, you know, northeastern Poland, western Belarus, southern Lithuania. These are all part of, you know, what we refer to, what in Jewish parlance is known as Lita. This was Lithuania. So, and you see how, you know, how dense it is, and many of these place names are going to be very familiar. Starting from Brisk and Bialystok, Vilna, Minsk, Slutsk. Okay, and this is where the book was sold, right? And we find that for the most part, things tend to cluster very, very locally. Meaning, if somebody is selling a book, they weren't usually selling it all over Europe. They were selling it close to home, right? And so you see, you know, and we could bring up another example. Evan Bochan. So here too, one of the interesting things about Evan Bochan, you see that there's more orange than there is red. And I'll explain what that means. So first of all, you see that there's just 2 main clusters, one in Western Slovakia and one in Eastern Slovakia. And there's a lot of these orange. The orange is when the bookseller didn't visit that place specifically, but merely met a person from one of those places on his, you know, elsewhere. That comes up a lot, and that's the case with Evan Bochan. That will come up a lot when you have yeshivot. And I'll show an example of that in a little while, of where there was a book that was sold in a particular community, but that community happened to have a yeshiva. And in Hungary, right, and Slovakia is, you know, until World War I is pretty much Hungary. In a town with a yeshiva, you'll have a list of the students that bought the book, and you'll also have where they're from. So if, let's say, he sold it in the yeshiva in Tushnad or in Pressburg, and students from 50 different places bought the book there, all of their communities are listed. So you see, you have the larger red circles, right? Bratislava, which is Pressburg, he sold 50 books. But those 50 books were to people from all over the place, were to people from everywhere, and you have a much larger spread. You have a much larger geographic spread when you're looking at the yellowish orange dots than you are when you're looking at the red dots, because and one of the things that we're working on, one of the avenues of research that we plan to pursue is to try to understand where were people, when people went to yeshivas in Hungary, how local were they? And how much, to what extent were the yeshivas really just geared toward the local population, the local students? And to what extent are they attracting students from faraway places, from Germany, from England, etc.? We know that there are American students and German students who went to study in the yeshivas in Lithuania. And the Lithuanian yeshivas were a lot more famous. But was this going on in Hungarian yeshivas, which were more numerous but much smaller? Was that going on there as well? Okay. Shall we stop here for a couple of questions before moving on?
Sure, we could do that. Let's see, there are a few questions here.
As I see that somebody mentioned Biala Tsertkava, which is another example like Salem, where it was called Sedei Lavan in Hebrew, or Schwarze Tuma, which means black impurity. Yes, and there are actually two places, both in the Ukraine, called Biala Tsertkava. One is in Galicia, and the other one is in Marmarosh, really right near Sighet. And I can even, if you don't believe me, I can demonstrate on our searchable map. Can everybody see that? Is that being shared?
Yes, it's being shared.
Okay. So here you have Sedei Lavan, two of them. One of them is Biala Tsertkava in central Ukraine, so it's not even in Galicia. That's probably Podolia, not far from Kiev, south of Kiev, and the other one right near Sighet, which was Hungarian until World War I. Also called Biala Tsertkava, and also known by Jews as Sedei Lavan. Okay, thank you. Katsav is, yes, we have PDFs of all of the different versions of all of the subsequent supplemental volumes of Katsav, his three volumes, and we haven't yet integrated them into the app that I showed you with the maps, and we haven't, but we're getting there. We do have a list of all of the books that he indexed, and we do have all of the we do have good high quality scans of everything that he did, thanks to Philip Trowering. And we'll get to, we are going to get to digitizing that. We're working out some bugs with the Katsav digitization before we release that, and before we move on to Katsav. Okay. The question was, how flexible is the English translation option on the searchable place database? Okay, so here's what we have. We are not indexing English place names at all. We're indexing Hebrew variants of place names that appear in Prenumeranten and in other Jewish literature in Hebrew characters. So if it's spelled according to Hebrew orthography or Yiddish orthography, doesn't really matter to us. That's what we're indexing. And as for the English, we're providing coordinates, and we have like a standard one one English place name. We are thinking of integrating all of the variant English place names that appear in the JewishGen community's database. So if you look at Bratislava, you'll get Pressburg and all sorts of things like, and you'll get Pressburg, and you'll also get Pozsony, all the different ways that things are spelled. But even with just Hebrew variants, there are places that have dozens and dozens of variant spellings. Okay, let's move on.
Rabbi Fischer, just a quick question, because I've seen a number of people post. Can we learn anything about the people who were purchasing the books in terms of their status or positions in the community? Were these community leaders? Were these just regular?
Yes, we'll get there. We'll get to that. By the way, I have not looked in the Q&A. I looked in the chat. I didn't look in the Q&A. So, and I'm probably, I multitasking. There's a limit to there's a limit to the multitasking ability, even of somebody like me with ADHD. If Avram, if you could sort of pre-digest those questions and pass them on, the next time we stop for questions, that'd be great.
Sure.
Okay. So this is an example of what I already showed you. Okay, so this is the example that I mentioned of Evan Bochan. Right, this is one page of Prenumeranten from the book Evan Bochan, published in Michalovce in Eastern Slovakia in 1931. So you see that, for example, Talmidei Yeshiva, Hagon HaTzadik, Rabbi Yoshua Greenwald, Av Bezdin of Ungvar v'Hagalil. Right, so you had Rabbi Yoshua Greenwald, that's the Chesed Yehoshua, who was he survived the Holocaust and came to the United States afterwards and wrote a book called Chesed Yehoshua. He was known as, if it's the same person that I'm thinking of, he ended up being the rabbi of Chust, which is very close to Ungvar, and he was known later as the Chuster Rav. And he had a yeshiva. He had a yeshiva in Ungvar, and here's a list. It says Avraham Gross from Satmar, and David Greenwald from Miava, and Naftali Tzvi Green, Yoshua Tzvi Klein from Salish, that's Vinoradiv in the Ukraine today. Naftali Tzvi Green in Haidu Besserman, a relatively large town in Hungary. So you see, and then the next one, you have the Yeshiva Harama in Ternau. And he even lists, Kol Elenes, all of these subscriptions were collected Alei Habachor HaMuflog Azriel Tzvi Segal Weiss Miyolnitza, Neiram Yair. Right? These were, so he had an agent, one of the students in the yeshiva served as his book-selling agent, and went and took these, subscriptions from the rest of the boys in the yeshiva and sold them. I don't know what he got in return. Maybe he got a free book. And then you have, again, the yeshiva in Ternau, and then you have the yeshiva in Michalovce. And that's in addition to these communities, Pressburg and Nitra and Topolshan, all in Western Slovakia, where it's telling you, where we're talking about Balabatim who are buying the book, right? Usually when there is a personage in the community, it'll indicate it, right? So here in Ternau, you have Kvod Kacho Adenenu Morenu V'Rabbeinu Harav Hagon Hatzadik Av Bezdin Shlita. Doesn't even tell us his name, unless this next part is also part of the name, but I don't think it is. I think that this is, the rabbi doesn't even need to be named. The great, illustrious, eminent rabbi and head of the rabbinical court of Turnau. And then Harav Hagon Shimon Aaron Sofer in Turnau. And then you have Shimon Aaron Sofer. He gets a Harav Hagon, so apparently also a personage. And then you just get a regular Moreno Harav, like rabbi. And then just other people just get names. Sometimes you'll get Ben Ha'admor. And in other places, usually the rabbi shows up at the beginning. If the rabbi is listed, he's usually the first one there. So in Medyer, you have Moreno Rav Yaakov Shental. And in Topolshan, Moreno Rav Menachem Zerkover. There are, right, and this we saw as well. Sometimes things get a lot more complex and interesting, and this is where Prenumeranten really start to become a fascinating historical source. Okay, this is a page from a book called Ein HaBedolach. Ein HaBedolach was published in Brooklyn in I think I wrote here 1934. I think it's actually 1937. Now, it was published in Brooklyn. I'm going to pull up a map before we look at the page of Prenumeranten. I'm going to pull up a map of, so Beryl Kagan does not index places in the United States. So any Prenumeranten Prenumeranten of books that were published in America, you will not find there. The mapping, we did it on our own. So an interesting thing that you'll see, first of all, you'll look, these are two different books, and for the two volumes. The first volume was published in 1937, the second in 1944. Let's skip the second volume for now. And you see that there are basically three clusters. One in the New York area, which is sort of to be expected. One in the area around Scranton, and then a massive one in the area around Pittsburgh. And here you end up having, he sells the book in these communities around Pittsburgh that I've never heard of, that these are really tiny places. Finleyville and Rankin and Charleroi and Trafford and Pitcairn and Exeter. Right, that's Aliquippa. So, and these are all places that have documented Jewish communities, right? The first ones I mentioned, we were talking earlier about New Jersey. Avram lives in Passaic, so yes, Passaic appears here in the 1937 edition, and I mentioned that also Perth Amboy, which is the only reason I know what Perth Amboy is because when we would, I'm from Baltimore, when we would drive to New York, when we got off the turnpike at exit 10 at Perth Amboy and take the outer bridge crossing, into Staten Island, and then across the Verrazano into Brooklyn, which is inevitably where we were going. But you see something here, which is really quite remarkable, which is the density of Jewish settlement around Pittsburgh. Now, when you look at the actual, okay, so here we are. These are the pages in Pittsburgh. Okay, so I color coded here to point a few things out. Okay, so we'll do this in order. In green, you have institutions, right? That sometimes the subscribers were not individuals, but institutions. So you have Kehila Kedosha Poalei Tzedek. A close friend of mine is actually the rabbi of Poalei Tzedek today. My uncle's father was the rabbi there for a very long time. That's Poalei Tzedek. Beis HaMedrash HaGadol, the large Beit Midrash. Chevra Agudas Achim, and so forth. And then you have Rodef Shalom, Harav Dr. Shlomo Beis Friedhof, Rav de Beit HaKnesses Rodef Shalom. That might be It's not surprising, but it's noteworthy because of all of these institutions, that's the only one, I believe, that already then was reformed. Solomon Freehoff was a reform rabbi, the rabbi of Rodef Shalom in Pittsburgh, a massive scholar. And he bought this book when it came out. Now, the book itself was published posthumously. The author died in the late 1800s, was a student of the Hatam Sofer, and these are his responses, right? The halachic answers to halachic questions that were posed to him. Now, I'm going to venture that very few people in Carnegie, Pennsylvania, and Old Forge, Pennsylvania, and these other places, Exeter, this is hardcore rabbinics. You don't really have a lot of, it's not, these aren't bestsellers, right? And yet you have a lot of people, somebody thought it was worthwhile to travel from town to town through the Pennsylvanian countryside selling the book, and people bought it. Why did people buy it? It's unlikely that they ever read it. So we see that, one thing is that, institutions bought it, but a lot of times people bought it as memorials. People bought it, right? And that's the next thing that I want to point out. If you look at the light blue, you see Lezecher Nishmat Aviv Rabbi Yitzchak bar Rabbi Avraham. Somebody bought the book, right, in memory of his father and his mother, and his mother Etia bat Mordechai. Lezecher Nishmat Aviv. So these are people that, if I could put a little psychological profile, people that they had moved to America. A lot of these people came from Hungary, and if you look at the pinkish purple, you'll see that they even said, put it down when you subscribe me. Said, this is where I'm from. So you have people from Hungary in general, or from the town of Seredna or Ungvar. And in fact, as a matter of historical fact, a lot of the Jews that settled in this area in Pennsylvania around Pittsburgh were originally from the Hungarian lands. I would venture that these people did not know, not only they weren't reading these books, but they probably couldn't read these books. They might have a basic working knowledge of Hebrew, but the hardcore rabbinics would have been outside of their skill level for the most part. And they were doing it because they thought, maybe this is something that my father, Olav Shalom, my grandfather, my mother, this is something from their world more than it's from my world, so I'm gonna buy the book in their memory. And so you have a lot of people that are mentioning their parents when they subscribe. The yellow is places that are outside of the area designated. So here under Pittsburgh, you have Olaquippa and Monaca, Pennsylvania, and in Scranton, you have Wilkes-Barre and Exeter, and in Carnegie, you have Pitcairn and Jeanette, etc. And the gray is women. Now that's something that doesn't come up very much so I shouldn't say that. Women subscribers is a phenomenon that's there from the beginning. The first Hebrew books that had subscribers lists in the late 1700s were published in Berlin by Maskilic circles, and you usually have a few women in each book. When you get to Hasidic books, when you get to Eastern Europe, it's a lot rarer. Although when you do have women, it usually will say, and even here you see it a little bit, it says, Nosan Aryeh Nigrashel al Yedei Bito Habsula Chana Toiba, right? So in Scranton, Chana Toiba Nurashel bought the book, right? And it mentions, by the way, Bito Habsula. She's single, she's eligible, she's buying these these rabbinic books. She's a frum girl, right? This is a way of advertising that. And sometimes you'll see here, Hagvira Marat Osnat Davis. That one really, who is this? Osnat is not a common word. And I actually found her obituary, this Mrs. Osnat Davis of Pittsburgh. And so you have, usually when it's, sometimes in other books, you'll see that the women that appear in the lists, it'll say either Habitullah, right, the unmarried girl, or it'll say Ha'almana, the widow, which indicates that there were actually more women subscribing. Just they were using their husbands or their fathers as a front, right? They were purchasing through them. And it's only when a woman can't purchase through her husband or through her father that her name will appear, which, it says something about how women wanted to be seen or were seen in something like this, which in some ways is considered public sphere, that it was somehow unacceptable for a married woman to appear on such a list, that only if she was unmarried because she was single or because she was widowed does her name appear. So that's something that we'd like to study more intensively. And another place that women come up, we'll switch now to the next, Nidvat P, published in Lviv in 1851. This is a Hasidic book. It was published by the Rebbe of Kamarna, the Kamarna Rebbe. Okay, what you see here is, so again, you have some institutions, right? The yellow is institutions. So you have one is purchased by the Klois, and here's another one for the Beis Medrash. Fine. Sometimes you do have, somebody asked if you could tell status from these things. So yeah, here you have Hagvir HaMeforsam, right? The well-known, generous, wealthy man, Meir Leibish Rappaport. And then the green is surnames, assigned surnames, right? Like Kraus and Lieber and Gutman. The purple is matronyms. Somebody would list their names they would list their own name by their mother's name. Avraham ben Necha, Shmuel Yonah ben Henya, Rav Nata ben Rasha, Yoav ben Esther. Now, this is not terribly common, but it's also not terribly uncommon. What's going on here is that we know that usually when, let's say, traditionally, when a man is called up to the Torah, he's called up by his name, Ben, his father's name. When in prayer, if someone is ill and people are praying for them or saying Tehillim for them, they'll use, traditionally, the mother's name would be used. And so when somebody went to a Hasidic Rebbe to get a blessing or to ask for intervention, for health, for parnasa, for children, whatever it was, they would usually use the mother's name because that's how people would identify themselves when it came to petitionary prayer. So you have something interesting here. When somebody is, and also when somebody went to this Rebbe, they would give a little bit of money as a donation and say, here, this is a pidyon. I'm giving a little bit of money to the Rebbe, in exchange for this bracha. And that was the accepted thing to do. And they would write a little kvittel or a zettel, right? They would say what it is that they want. So here you have, people are subscribing to a book, but they feel that by subscribing to the book of this particular holy Rebbe, this Rebbe is going to see their name and will have them in mind and will daven for them, right? And will bless them. And so without anyone telling them to, they wrote down their names and their mother's names. and not their fathers' names. You have two outliers here, but the outliers in the orange are the ones that use the father's name. Moshe Aaron Rabbi Yitzchak, Nachum ben Rabbi Yehuda. Right? And then there were other places where people were already using their surnames. So I think, and again, this opens questions more than it answers them. When were people using mother's name? When were people using father's name? When were people using surnames, right? And we can trace Jews had, there's two questions. Number one is when Jews were assigned surnames. And then the second one is when Jews began to use surnames and in what contexts. I mean, it could be that officially, somebody's name was Weiss or Schwartz, but they wouldn't use that name. It took another few generations for that to percolate through and for people to begin to identify themselves by their assigned surnames. And you have that special kind of surname, and this is the light blue in this page, the special kind of surname, which is the occupational surname, right? So you have Dayan, right? The name given to a rabbinical court judge, or Katz, which originally it meant somebody who was a priest in the temple, but now it's somebody of that lineage. And then the last one is Shub, which stands for Shochedu Bodek, right? And so you have a lot of Jews that are walking around with the name Shochet. So you have Shochet or Shechtman or Shochat. You also have names like Reznik, which means Shochet, and the name, and you can also come across the name Shub. The name Shub itself is a Jewish surname, and these were not assigned surnames. People were identified by these names long before surnames were assigned. And the same would go for surnames like Chazan or Shamus, Shames, Shamus, Rabbin for rabbi. Surnames like that, occupational surnames of Jews, and I'm sure that there are several others that the audience here can point out. How are we doing with time?
I think we are right at that mark. If you do have some time to take a few questions.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much. This was a really fascinating presentation. Let me go through the chat and the Q&A to see.
Yeah, wow. I see that there are a ton of questions.
A lot of things. I'll just read some of them quickly and you can just answer. Are any secular books included on these lists?
Yes, secular books that were published in Hebrew. For example, we have one of the first books, I don't know if you would consider this to be a secular book, one of the first books ever to have Prenumeranten was an edition of Aristotle's Book of Ethics. Can even share that. We'll pull that up. Here it comes. So here you have Sefer Hamidot Aristotelis, right? The first part of the Book of Ethics by Aristotle, the first 5 of the 10 books, right? And you have the Ethica Aristotelis, published in 1790, and you have a list of Prenumeranten. It's a straight list. It's not by town. I actually highlighted here some of the different towns. As you can see, it's not the highest quality of scanning. Sometimes you have some interesting people that show up here. So for example, this one that I highlighted, Rabbi Yakovka ben Hagon mi Prague. That is Rabbi Yaakov Landau, who was the son of the chief rabbi of Prague, Rabbi Yechezkel Landau. and who was studying in the city of Brody in the Ukraine, which is where his father also studied. So Rav Yaakovka ben Hagon, so you have a rabbi from a very illustrious rabbinic family who's buying this book, but it's not a religious book per se. I guess it would depend how you define religious books. We also have, but there are books of poetry, there are books of literature. Peretz Smolenskin's books had Prenumeranten.
Mhm. Okay. Another question is, as it relates to Sephardic communities, were things like this done in a similar way?
Not really. I'm looking, but not really. The model there seems to have been more straight sponsorship. There would be one or two people that would fund the publication of the book. In fact, there's one book that was published in Livorno in the 1800s that was published in two different editions. One that was distributed in North Africa and one that was distributed in Europe. The one in Europe has Prenumeranten. The one that was distributed in North Africa has a list of several wealthy benefactors from communities in what's today Algeria, from Oran and Algiers and Constantine, that who helped fund the book, but they weren't pre-subscribers per se. I don't know why that is, but it's just one of those cultural quirks. You do have a few Sephardic books in the Crimea and in, let's say, the European parts of Turkey, Thessaly. So you do have a few places, borderlands between Ashkenaz and Sfarad. You also have Sephardic communities in Europe, like in Amsterdam and Hamburg, also appear on the lists occasionally. But for the most part, in the Sephardic lands, right, in the Muslim lands, you didn't have the phenomenon of Prenumeranten, almost didn't exist.
Very interesting. If somebody would like to get involved with your project and to volunteer, is there an easy way for them to reach out?
So I'm going to put in an email address, just info@HaMapah.org. There's a question: how can someone who's not fluent in Hebrew help your project? Well, it happens to be that not all Prenumeranten are in Hebrew or Yiddish. We have Prenumeranten in Polish. We have Prenumeranten in Russian, in French, in English, in Italian. These are, we're going to get to all of them. But as we release things, we'll, keep your eyes on the site. As we release things, we'll let you know. And a few people have mentioned the Kehillah links. That we're aware of what's being done on the Kehillah links. That there are people that are taking communities and going through Beryl Kagan and Moshe Katsav, not Moshe Katsav. Can't remember his first name. Shlomo Katsav. Maybe it is Moshe. I can't remember. That are taking Kagan and Katsav and listing all of the subscribers from those, from that particular community. So now again, there are 9,000 different communities, but every little bit is going to help. And we're working on, we'll collate that information eventually. That's eventually my dream is that all of these every person on a subscriber list will have an authority file. So that'll include all the different variant spellings of the person's name, where they lived, when they lived, so that if that person comes up in another Prenumeranten list or in another record, or in a birth record or a death record or a marriage record, or if that person comes up, is mentioned in another book, they'll all, it'll all be linked. We'll be able to, every new record about a person will be linked through that database. Now, similar things are happening today on, genealogy web portals, but those are not, their access is barred. It's very difficult to, it's very difficult to have any sort of one-stop shopping unless, you're number one, a paid subscriber, and number two, you're talking, they don't use the same, they're not digitizing the same materials that we're digitizing. So ultimately, I would hope that there's like a VIAF sort of authority files for anybody that's, that's mentioned in these things, so that at any time a new record comes, is discovered about a particular person, it'll be added to that authority file.
Well, the email again is info@HaMapah, info@HAMAPAH.org. What we'll do is we'll send out an email to everybody who's registered with that information as well. Hope that if anybody wants to get involved, please reach out to Rabbi Fischer. If anybody would like to get involved with Jewish Gen's efforts for rabbinic genealogy, please reach out to us at support@JewishGen.org. Rabbi Fischer, thank you again. Thanks for all the work that you're doing. We're glad to partner together with you. We wish you much success.
Thank you.
And we wish you and everybody a wonderful and a happy Passover.
You too.
Take care.
Chag Sameach.